Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, and in this week's video we'll be taking a look at how I built this Cedar planter box. So for this build I'm using 1x4 by 8 foot long cedar boards. I used 5 altogether, and I've got 4 here that I'm first cross cutting to length. So I cut those 4 boards to 60 inches, you could probably get away with 54 inches, and then I ran each edge of each board on the joiner to make sure I got a flat surface for the glue up. If you don't have a joiner, you could definitely skip this step. I just wanted my glue seam to be a little tighter, so I ran them on the joiner first. After we have our boards cut to the approximate dimensions that we want, it was time to glue them up into a panel. And after the glue is dried, we'll cut this panel into 4 pieces, which will make the side frames of this planter box. If you can, try to make sure that the boards all set flush with each other and that there aren't any big gaps or ledges in between the boards. If there are, that's okay because this box is supposed to look a little more rustic anyway, but I like to try to get everything to glue up as flush as possible. A few hours later and the glue was dry. The next step was to mark the pitch of the angle on the frame, which you do by marking 0 and 14 inches on one side and then 2 and 12 inches on the other side. Then you just connect the dots, the 2 goes to the 0 and the 12 goes to the 14, and by doing this you can mark the angle perfectly without actually measuring that angle. Once you have the line marked, you can just take this over to the miter saw, or you could use a table saw here, and you simply cut on that line. You want to leave the line in, and then after we have the first piece cut out, we'll flip the board around, cut the same exact angle on the other side, and we'll be left with a trapezoid shaped board. Whenever you go to cut the next piece, all you have to do is flip the original board over, and then use that first cut off trapezoid as a pattern to line that second cut up. You keep flipping this over until you've made 4 pieces cut out altogether. Since all of these pieces are cut at an angle, we now need to rip a 45-degree angle on the side of each piece. That way they can fit together and form the box. To make sure that this piece is parallel and in line with the blade, I first line up one side in the miter slot where that miter gauge goes. Then I slide the miter gauge up and adjust the angle to where that board sets. That'll make sure that the side of this board that I'm ripping off is perfectly in line with the blade, and all of these boards will line up when I assemble them into the box shape. With all of the edges ripped to 45 degrees, you can grab a couple pieces and see how they fit together. These corner clamps really help to keep everything in place and make sure that you have it lined up the way that you want. Once this thing is assembled, we'll put a border on the top, and you can see here, because we cut these on an angle, there's a gap at the top where the top piece of this isn't flat. So since we cut everything else at an angle, we'll need to rip the inside corner of each of these off that I'm pointing to here at the same angle that we cut all the other boards at. So looking at our miter gauge, we can see that the angle on that was 9 degrees, which is also the same angle that is on the miter saw. So if we adjust the saw blade on the table saw to 9 degrees as well, then whenever we make those cuts to flatten the top and the bottom of these boards, they should line up and everything should end up square. So a thing to note here is that when you're cutting the top piece off, you want the outside of the box facing down. And then whenever you flip these over to cut the bottom piece off, you want the outside of the box facing up. If you get this backwards, then your angle will be even further exaggerated and you'll have to cut this down even further. So take your time here and make sure that you have the board facing the right way to get that angle cut flush, which will allow both the top and the bottom of this thing to set flat whenever it's completely finished. So with a little glue on the seams and that corner clamp in place to hold everything together, I just attached these frame pieces using brad nails. And we'll hide these corner seams with some trim later in the video, so you don't have to worry if your brad nails look a little sloppy here because they'll be covered up later. That said, you don't want to get too wild with the glue because any glue you don't clean up will show through after you have the finish on. Also try to make sure that you don't get any spring out from any of the brad nails because you might not be able to cover up those brad nails coming out the side with a trim piece. This last piece was a little bit harder to get in place and I had to influence it with a clamp, so something was probably slightly off square, but it ended up working out okay. The next step was to rip some trim pieces down to width. I think this is about 1.5 inches here, and these are just the leftover strips from the other part when I cross-cut those 8-foot boards in the very beginning of the video. So this is the scrap left over from that, and you should have enough to do all 8 trim pieces with the remaining cut off. Attaching these trim pieces is pretty simple. You just put a little glue down on the frame, clamp one of the trim pieces in place, and use a different trim piece to make sure that it's lined up with no gaps where they meet. Then you just flip it over and attach it from the inside using brad nails. This way there wouldn't be any brad nail holes or any marks on the outside of the trim. Rather than try to cut these trim pieces to length with the correct compound angle before I put them on, I just trim them off with this pole saw. This makes it a whole lot easier and it only takes a minute or two. You can also use the top piece of the frame as kind of a guide to keep the saw lined up as you make the cut. So I first put the trim pieces on 2 opposite sides, then I put the pieces on the adjacent sides, which would overlap those original trim pieces on the first 2 sides. This is done the exact same way as those first pieces. You just want to make sure that these pieces are lined up with those original pieces. And you can see here that I put a couple clamps on the sides to get rid of that gap and make sure that they glued together tight without showing any major seams. The last step of the actual building process was to put a border around the top. So I cut some pieces from the 5th board that I hadn't used yet, and then I ripped them all to width. I think the width of these is somewhere just over 1.75 inches. So I put each piece in place on top, and then I used the square to measure and mark a 45-degree angle where they would line up with those trim pieces below. Then I just cut the angle on my table saw. You could also make this cut on a miter saw. I just chose to use the table saw because I haven't had the chance to line miters up and I wanted to see how well they lined up, which ended up working really well. So we're making the top border with 4 pieces, each cut to that 45-degree angle. So I like to put them on one at a time, line the other piece up, and then cut that angle off until you finally have 4 equal pieces. You'll want to leave each of these border pieces just a little bit longer than it should be to line up perfectly. That way, if the frame isn't perfectly square, there will be enough overhang from that border to cover up the top of the frame completely. The last thing that I did before putting finish on this was to take a 1/4 inch round over with a palm router, go around all of the trim, and soften up all of those sharp edges with a nice round over. This step is optional, of course, but rounding over all of those sharp edges really gives this a complete look, and I thought that this made it look way better. With all of those edges softened up, the last step was to put the finish on this. For this, I'm using Rubio Monocoat Pure, and I'm not sure if Rubio is a finish that is recommended on cedar or recommended to be outside, but I had some Rubio left over from a previous project where I mixed too much of it up. So I had the leftover in this cup and it was starting to dry, so I just figured I would go ahead and use it up rather than letting it go to waste. Also, this will be underneath a porch outside, so it's not like it'll be out directly under the weather or in the rain, so hopefully this finish will hold up well over time. So at this point you could put a bottom on this thing and fill it up with dirt, or you could put some type of liner in it and fill it up with dirt. I decided to leave the plant in the bucket that it was in, and I just put these support beams in the middle wedged into place that would put the bucket exactly at the same height with the top. With those wedged into place, all that was left to do was to drop the plant in the top, and then everything was finished. So here's a couple pictures of how everything turned out. I think this turned out really well. This was a fun build, a quick build, and I always enjoy a chance to use cedar. So if you made it this far, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and as always, stay tuned for more.